You're listening to the Today's Wills and Probate podcast, one of the leading sources of information for the wills and probate sector. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todayswillsandprobate.co.uk and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Wills and Probate podcast. Today is a very special edition of the podcast, and I'm delighted to welcome someone who I hope for many of us probably needs very little introduction, former broadcaster and journalist Alastair Stewart. Alastair, really fantastic of you to join the podcast. I'm very grateful for you being here. We're going to talk a little bit about your professional life and your journey as well, but also in the last couple of years you've been diagnosed with dementia, which of course affects both our listeners and their clients as well. So looking forward to a really interesting discussion. First of all, as I say, hopefully you don't need a lot of introduction, but tell us a little bit about yourself, Alastair, and your professional career.
Well, thank you very much for talking to me and giving me the chance to talk to you and your colleagues in such a really important field of expertise. And those of us who have dementia really need support from people like trustees and solicitors and the rest of it. So I'll be delighted to talk in general terms, but also one or two specifics, things like power of attorney, but I'll leave you as the expert to guide us through that. My father was in the Royal Air Force and my mother was a retired Wren. She'd been in the Royal Navy. That's how they met, fell in love and got married and had two children, my big brother and me. It meant that we moved home every 2-3 years, as anyone who has been in the services will know, or many of the audience who may well have clients who are either still serving or retired from the armed services. It's a very disruptive childhood in that sense, but it was a very happy one and a very interesting one. Dad was in fighter command, then bomber command. And I lived quite literally with the Cold War when I was growing up. Dad was one of those flyers. He was a navigator who used to scoot off, be scrambled, as the RAF say, and follow Russian bombers that were tracking the North Sea coast and straying into our airspace, which is, of course, still going on. The Russian Navy do it now as well. And I can remember having quite intense and detailed conversations with my parents, and particularly my dad, about what that meant and why it was going on. And then later on, he was in Bomber Command and he commanded a squadron of V-bombers. They were called Valiants and carried nuclear weapons. And he was also officer commanding operations at RAF Scampton in Lincolnshire, which had 3 squadrons of Vulcans, all of which had nuclear weapons, ready to go at 3 minutes' notice. So the Cold War and the difference between communism and democracy was a really important part of my growing up, and I think was the first real bait to, I'd like to say, a relatively bright young kid to get into journalism and into broadcasting, because these were really important subjects: life and death, future of the world. And lo and behold, one of my all-time great stories was the fall of the Berlin Wall, when in effect communism threw its hands up and surrendered and the Western democracy had won. So that was a great celebration. So I went to a series of schools. I had to go to boarding school, as did my brother, which we both hated. But it wasn't because mum and dad didn't love us, quite the opposite. It was because education was crucially important to both of them. And my father was very much a working class lad made good, who passed his 11 plus, went to grammar school, went to St Andrews University, having matriculated very young, which is the equivalent of A levels. And to him, education was the key to advancement, economic advancement, social advancement, and just the key to everything. So he didn't want to risk my brother and I screwing up our education by changing schools every couple of years. So it meant boarding school, which, as I say, neither of us liked, but we accepted it was important. My brother went on to the motor industry, became a salesman, promotional manager. He was very practical, engineering type skills. And I went to Bristol University and did economics. which also caught I did a joint honours thing, economics and politics, and that was the confirmation of what I wanted to do when I eventually grew up, and it was to become a journalist, to focus particularly on politics and economics. So that's me. And I started off at Southern Television in Southampton, which was one of the ITV stations in the 70s, and went from there ultimately to ITN. And when I left ITN, I very happily went to GB News, which I really loved.
It's a fabulous plotted history and wonderful stories. Expect nothing less. Tell us then about how your journey towards diagnosis evolved. I mentioned that you were diagnosed a few years ago. Did it come as a bit of a shock? How did that sort of journey evolve for you?
Sure. It didn't come as a total shock because I'd read a bit about it, and some people I know, like Fiona Phillips, whose husband runs ITV's This Morning's programme, has Alzheimer's, which is different to vascular dementia. It's more complex as an illness and tends to be fatal, whereas vascular dementia tends to be irritating. And the other extraordinary thing, which you and your friends may or may not know, but dementia in all of its forms is now one of the most common ailments that we have, partly because it can be caused by Alzheimer's, which develops in the brain, or it can be caused, as in my case, with vascular dementia, which is normally traced back to high blood pressure. And that can mean leading a life like you and your colleagues do, or me, of intense pressure and focus and hard work. And in my case, in my youth, smoking and drinking too much, which raises blood pressure. When you're eventually diagnosed with dementia, those are two things that they urge you to give up ASAP. And I'd already given up drinking because I'd had a little difficulty with that in my youth. It became, as a colleague of mine in ITV once said, I don't know if you've got a problem with alcohol, but you're one of those people to whom alcohol is not a friend. And that was a very good piece of advice. So in terms of the diagnosis, I had begun to think that I was not remembering things as clearly as I used to. And it wasn't necessarily, what's the Battle of Hastings 1066 or Magna Carta 1215. It was, where did I put my spectacles?
Yeah.
Or did I change the batteries in my hearing aids? It was little things, what my daughter called the sort of motor skills. And I would occasionally feel unsteady on my feet. A word I've used in other conversations is discombobulated, just a bit sort of all over the place. And when I was at GB News, I used to stay in a hotel in London to cut back on the commuting from Hampshire, where I live, up to London. And I was due into the studio, having written the scripts the night before with my team, in the studio at about, 6:30. And I began to turn up early. And I think that was partly because I was beginning to panic that I might forget to go in, or I'd go to the wrong place, or I wouldn't take my laptop and my notes. The team would say, it's 6:30. Why are you here? You're not due until 7. And then I remember on a couple of occasions, one or two would say, your tie isn't done up properly, or you've got your shoes on the wrong feet, literally, which was not the end of the world, but it was bloody irritating for someone who took their appearance very seriously. If you appear on television, you owe it to the audience to not look like a scarecrow. So that began to worry me, and it also began to worry my bosses. And I always give a big shout out to the GB News bosses, because they were incredibly supportive, and we had lots of chats about it. And we all agreed, the team I worked with and the bosses, that I should just go and see my GP and discuss it with him. And I sat down with my GP and I said, look, I think I might have dementia. And he said, well, I don't know. I'm a GP. I'm not an expert in these things. Talk it through. And I did to him, literally, as I'd just done you. No, nothing held back, telling the truth. And he said, look, the only way we can find out is for you to have an MRI scan. And that will detect what's going on in your brain. And that scan showed that I had a series of mini strokes. They're called infarct, FARCT strokes. And as my daughter spotted with her thing about motor skills, it's like a scattergun. It just knocks out little bits of your brain, like it might be the bit of brain that looks after doing up shoelaces or tying a tie, or where you've put things down. And unfortunately, with vascular dementia, you can't get it back. You can stop it getting worse by working very hard on getting your blood pressure down, which we've done. And so, touch wood, my diagnosis, which was about 3 years ago, is still there, but it hasn't got any worse. And I'd like to think, as with my introduction conversation with you, I can remember things pretty well. I think the most terrifying thing when the consultant eventually said, look, we've looked at the results of the MRI scan and you have got vascular dementia, was the word dementia, because, it comes from demented. And you think, blimey, I'm sort of gone a bit nutty, and I don't mean to be politically incorrect or hateful to people, but dementia doesn't mean you're mad or you're stupid. Quite the opposite. I mean, my analytical brain and what's going on with the government and the budget row and all of that is as clear as it was when I was at ITN. And I can engage in great conversations with senior politicians or friends or my very bright wife, who you've already met in conversation, without any difficulty. But like I sent you an email and our mutual friend, Nick, last night, I wasn't confident yesterday evening whether we were beginning our conversation at 3 o'clock or 2 o'clock. Right, I just couldn't remember. So I emailed both of you and you very kindly said, don't worry, I'll confirm it in the morning, which you did. So here we are around about 3 o'clock having our conversation.
How do you feel as though your diagnosis affected you professionally? I mean, you've talked about some of the personal impact on you. How did it affect you professionally?
In terms of content, can you come up and cover the death of late Queen, which was a great honour I was asked to do, and then can you cover the coronation of Charles, which I did as well? My response to that is yes, absolutely no problem at all in terms of content, because I'm a history addict. I did history A-level and I just feed off current affairs, and I reread 2 or 3 biographies I've got of Charles just to remind myself. I didn't really need to remind myself anything about Elizabeth II, because we've all lived with her for so long, or past tense we had. The impact is, so if GB News, which they do occasionally, either phone up or email and say, look, can you come up this afternoon because Keir Starmer's making a statement about X, Y, or Z, which you covered when you were at ITN. I'd be inclined to say to them, I'll very happily join a conversation via Zoom or via meetings. But Sally doesn't like me going up to London on my own. And because I'm so dependent upon her, she keeps the diary, as you know, because she booked this conversation. And she has to do everything because I don't drive anymore. I don't allow myself to risk it. That was one of the symptoms as well. I lost sense of where I was, position and so on.
Sure.
So it limits my logistical capacity to go to work, but it doesn't limit the content. And I'm very happy to write. I do a dementia diary every week, which is rich in politics and history, because like when John Healey, the Defence Secretary, was talking about the Russian spy ship, all of my father's antics of flying up to look at those bombers came back to mind. So again, I didn't have to look it up. I could just write it from memory. But I couldn't easily just pop on the train and go up to London. I don't like to drag Sal up with me. But one of the reasons she doesn't like me going on my own is in case I get lost. And, let's get a taxi back to Waterloo. And I fear I'm likely to step in front of a taxi rather than just hail it. And that's because I'm just not concentrating and I am discombobulated. I remember I had lunch shortly after the diagnosis with Charles Clarke, one of my great heroes. He was president of NUS when I was deputy president, and he went on to be Home Secretary, chairman of the Labour Party, a towering figure of public life. And he very kindly offered to take me out for lunch. And I said, yes, that would be great. I'll come up to Waterloo and then I'll come across to the restaurant, which was in the South Bank. And he said, do you want me to meet you at the platform head? Excuse me. And I said, no, that's fine. That's fine. And he said, I'm not sure that I want to risk losing you. We've gone to all of this trouble to try and meet up for lunch, so I will meet you. So there, when the train pulled in, was the former Home Secretary, Charles Clarke, waiting to escort me to the restaurant. So, that's just delightful. And there are many, many people like that who've been utterly charming and been so kind with their time and their consideration.
You mentioned Sally, your wife, who obviously is a steadfast support for you.
Totally.
I mean, on a personal level, you've had to bring people around you or ensure that you've got that support network around you personally then as well.
Yes, very much so. And what the Alzheimer's Society, which I know you know, and Alzheimer's Research UK and also Dementia UK, they're two big headlines, I think. If you think you might have dementia because you've read about the symptoms, forgetfulness, discombobulation, not knowing how close you are to something or how far you are from it, then go and get a diagnosis, because particularly in the case of vascular dementia, you can stop it getting worse. Mm-hmm. But the other thing that's crucial is you need to share at the earliest possible convenience the fact that you've got dementia with your loved ones, those who are closest to you, because you will become dependent upon them. So, my beautiful wife, gorgeous, clever creature that she is now my carer, in effect, which is, she takes it in her stride, and I'm very lucky because it's not easy, and it's a shift in a relationship, a fundamental shift. I had 2 children with, and now before we go out, she has to make sure my tie's done up, my shoes are done up, and what have you, as opposed to something more affectionate. But also, we've got 4 children, 3 boys and 1 girl, and they are all of them brilliant. And the eldest one, Alexander, is one of the cleverest people I know. They're both, he and his sister are very, very clever. They both went to university and both got firsts. So their conversations are incredibly stimulating, and I cherish them and look forward to them. Clemmy, the daughter, is a qualified teacher, and she is an educationalist now in Saudi Arabia. She was the headmistress of an amazing school that won an award for being the most advanced in terms of diversity, specializing in special education needs, but also putting boys and girls together. And now she's helping another company set up a chain of schools out there. So we have lots to talk about. Alexander was a Winchester scholar, Oxford first, was in the police for a while, and now writes about football and helps train footballers in communication skills and works with football clubs if they need to buy new players and things like that. So not my field, but it's fascinating.
I'm conscious that we only have a short period of time for the podcast, and there's 1,000,001 questions I'd love to ask you, Alastair. But let me move on and talk to you about some of the advice that you might have sought at the time around your diagnosis, but also in the time since, because presumably, and you know what they say about assuming, but did you engage with legal services at the time? Did you find some solace in doing that as well?
Yes, I did, and I'm particularly, given the audience, I'm delighted to say that we became keenly aware through conversations that we needed to check and double check our wills, just given my new condition, because the will was drawn up initially when Freddie and Oscar were much, much younger. Mm-hmm. And so we'd appointed some couple of friends of ours as guardians. And now Alex and Clem, the elder children, in inverted commas, are in their 40s and incredibly responsible adults. Clearly, God forbid, when both of us have gone, they will be, they'll legally take on what is already their moral relationship, and they'll take over in loco parentis, as it were. Mm-hmm. So that needed to be changed. The other thing which the audience should take note of is that if you have dementia, even in a mild form, an awful lot of things like banking, any online purchases, anything to do with money, mortgages becomes a lot more complicated because
Sure.
you simply are less good at anything online, even applying for benefits. And there are two benefits that people with dementia may be eligible for. One is a discount on council tax, and the other is a thing called the attendance allowance, which really is there to try and help out your carer. But you try and fill that form in on your own if you've got dementia, and it's a bloody nightmare.
Mhm.
God forbid you have to try for the pensioners credit. If government wanted to do anything to help, they could just make those yes-no interludes, and it really would matter. But power of attorney means that if we have to try and renew our mortgage, which we inevitably will have to do, then Alex and Clemmy will do it with power of attorney. And I trust them totally, but it's legally important. And so anyone who's listening who has a client who presents and says, look, I've just been diagnosed with dementia, their number one question should be, can I help you just review your will to make sure it makes sense still? And it takes into account the fact that worst comes to the worst, you may need to be thinking about care costs rather than generosity to the rest of the family. Secondly, you really do need to look at power of attorney, not just for your bank, but credit cards, mortgages, all sorts of stuff. And it's a conversation that anyone with dementia will welcome. They won't feel spooked out by it. So we went to our solicitor locally, and he was great. And we had one interesting conversation because it was shortly after the budget. And he said, oh, you live on a farm. And he said, have you thought about this inheritance tax problem?
I think I know where this one's going. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we had that conversation. And he said, but unfortunately, because it's an equestrian centre and not a farm that has cattle or grows grain, you don't qualify for any of the allowances anyway. So don't include that in your financial planning. But equally, don't worry about, passing it on to your children, because you won't be hit by the new farmers allowance hit. So that was an unexpected but useful conversation from a very good solicitor.
I must admit, I think people like yourself, and I always think about Kate Garraway, another example of somebody who has done a huge amount of very positive work in terms of raising the profile of the importance of later life planning, and I mean all the trials and tribulations that she went through with her husband, for example. One of the things I was struck by as I was doing my research, Alastair, is you went into war zones. You talked about the fact that you were very heavily involved in some of the reporting around the Cold War, that kind of thing. I mean, in your professional life, were you ever encouraged to think about later life planning? I know, for example, I've got family in the forces, and they are, they're encouraged to write a will, for example, before they're sent overseas.
Yes.
Does the media profession have that level of well-being and support for its staff?
No, it doesn't. Funnily enough, it has nothing to do with wills or anything, but if you were going to a war zone, they do have courses for sort of health and safety courses, where to go and where not to go, which sometimes can be very helpful. But in one very tragic case, a very close friend of mine, Terry Lloyd, was shot by the Americans, not by the Iraqis, in the Gulf War through a misunderstanding. And he'd had the training, but it does happen. And annually, my profession has its awards, the Royal Television Society Journalism Awards. And there's always Roll of Honour, men and women who have died in the pursuit of journalism, and particularly broadcast journalism. And it's terrifying. And it isn't only Syria and Iraq and the Gulf. It's all sorts of places where it happens these days. It doesn't happen in Gaza because we're not allowed in, ironically. But no, I don't think so. I think the advice, and I mean, I've always had accountants, some better than others, and I've always had solicitors. When I was starting out, there was a lovely guy called Stephen Gold who has written a brilliant book called Gold's Law, which is kind of almost law for idiots. Stephen is far from an idiot. He went on to become a district judge in Richmond and has remained a very close friend. But he was a bog standard solicitor in Portsmouth. And so Sally and I were based at Southern TV in Southampton, and he was our solicitor and his brother Lenny was our accountant. So I think I got that from my father. who was, as I've said to you, in the military and the Air Force. And financial planning was very important to him. Although he always used to say, you never ask anybody how much they earn or how they vote, because that's not allowed. But I think we were aware of the need to be cautious about that. I mean, I think in terms, it's a duty of bosses, I think, rather than necessarily workers themselves. And I had the pleasure of working for GB News, who were very good bosses and very supportive and helpful. I wouldn't say the same about ITN, unfortunately. In the more recent years, they've been very slightly sort of here today, gone tomorrow types, although there were some good ones in the early days. But no, I don't remember ever one of my bosses saying, look, you're going to the Gulf War for what, maybe 2 or 3 months. It ended up being nearly 4 months. We did have to wear nuclear and chemical and biological warfare suits. We had hypodermics and pills in our pockets. And when the sirens went, we had to go to air raid shelters. But so that was thoughtful, but nobody ever said, by the way, have you got a will and have you done anything about that? And there were not, I mean, the Berlin Wall got quite hairy, but fortunately it passed off okay in the end. But no, and I think that's a shame. I think employers should do that to anyone who is in a precarious trade.
I mean, I actually think, Alastair, that regardless of whether you're in a precarious trade, perhaps employers these days have got a duty of care to these things. And if you even sort of go a little bit earlier than that, perhaps it's something that schools could encourage as well. But that's an entirely different conversation.
Yes,
absolutely.
Yes, I mean, it is interesting though, because I totally agree with the idea of trying to include basic economics in the national curriculum, because one thing that's always struck me is, again, I can remember my father, even when I went to university, I had no money other than the money he kindly gave me to go through that. The idea of getting a bank account and keeping an eye on budgets. And, if you spend £5 in the bar, you haven't got £5 to spend on a book. And it was as simple and basic as that. And I think the idea of beginning that early with children, because a lot of kids nowadays with their wretched mobile phones do have access to financial services without any education. And my generation hardly ever, if ever, met a bank manager. When you're at university, they bombard you with, here's a book token, come and bank with Lloyds, or here's a meal ticket for McDonald's, come and bank with NatWest. But the idea of sitting down with a bank manager and saying, look, I earn 25 grand a year, what's the maximum mortgage I can have? I can remember doing that, but very, very few people nowadays do it.
I want to go back to thinking about some of the context that sits behind support for dementia, because there are critical failures in social care. I mean, well documented ones as well. And, here is not the place to try and put some of those things right. I'm not sort of asking you to do any political grandstanding, but, what support should there be for people living with dementia? When I was chatting with Sally, for example, she said there's quite a lot out there initially, but it sort of starts to wane fairly quickly thereafter.
Yes. There was last weekend in the Mail on Sunday, there was a brilliant piece which was done in conjunction with Alzheimer's Research UK. And Timothy West, the wonderful actor who died recently, and Prue, his late wife, who had Alzheimer's. And Timothy made a point in that article where he said it very rapidly became clear after the diagnosis that we were, quotes, on our own, close quotes. And I went on X or Twitter and said, I recommend anyone who's got dementia or has a member of their family or friend who's got dementia to read that article, because it's compelling. And, if you're as famous and wealthy as Timothy West, if you've got to go through it, then the rest of us sure as hell are going to go through it. And it brought to mind a conversation I had when Sally and I, because she always comes to every medical event that I have, just to make sure I don't miss any important point or get something wrong like symptoms. So she sat in on the diagnosis, and we sat opposite a consultant psychiatrist who said, we've got the results now and you've got vascular dementia. The good news is you haven't got Alzheimer's, which, relatively speaking, I suppose is true. And Sal said, so what happens now? He basically said, not a lot. He said, there's a lot of charities out there who are great, and that's true. Alzheimer's have a network of nurses. Alzheimer's Research UK do brilliant work on research, trying to find treatments which the NHS then say are too expensive, which may well be true. Not for me to say. But nobody says anything about money, because you suddenly find, I chose to retire early because I knew I wasn't confident about getting to work and functioning logistically adequately.
Sure.
And so, I went from a very handsome salary to a private pension and a state pension. And nobody talks you through that. It was a friend of Sal's, who's a former occupational therapist, who told us about attendance allowance. And I read in one of the newspapers about the discount on council tax. But you've got to do it on your own.
Yeah.
And there's and Timothy made this point very strongly, there's no psychological or psychiatric support, either for people who've got dementia or for their carers, their partners, both of whom are going through absolute bloody nightmares, thinking, here am I'm the guy who covered the fall of the Berlin Wall. I'm the guy who did the first debate between party leaders in this country on television, and I can't even tie my shoelaces. Now, apart from my shoes fall off, imagine what impact that has on me emotionally. Yeah. And there's nobody there to help apart from Sal, bless her heart, who does the shoelaces and says, oh, come on, we'll be all right. Let's go out. We'll have a good time. It should be better than that, and the government should think it through.
As we move to a close, Alastair, and you've been incredibly generous with your time, thank you. I just wonder if you might share some final thoughts, advice, guidance for people listening who are dealing with clients who may have dementia, and what they might do to support them, for example, or how they could make accommodation for them.
Yes, and I say it via you and your lovely friends in the audience to everybody, and it's this: dementia is terrifyingly common, but it's not terrifying. It changes your life, and it makes you dependent upon other people, but through that, and that includes solicitors, attorneys, trustees, your audience and you, but lovers, wives, children, neighbours, all sorts of people. And so it's not terrifying, but it is terrifyingly common. And my appeal would be, don't dismiss us because you don't completely understand the word dementia. It's not a form of demented. It means that bits of your brain don't work, and you therefore need support and help. And if you're in one of those support professions, like being a lawyer or an accountant, then make allowances for someone with dementia. Think of a set of questions you might put to somebody like a bright teenager who hasn't had the life experience yet to know what a will means and how important it is, because someone with dementia might have forgotten that, and they don't need to be lectured or talked down to. They just, as you've been good enough, David, just need to have an intelligent, respectful conversation. But you should, as an attorney, a solicitor, an accountant, be prepared for that, because the person who turns up might be that bloke who used to read the news at 10 o'clock, or it might be the vicar. You just don't know.
Be generous with it, Alastair, and thank you so much for joining the Today's Wills and Probate podcast. I hope, whilst it's not been a very direct conversation about the impact of wills and probate on professionals, I hope that people will take some of your impassioned please away with them as well, because it's really important. And there are, of course, opportunities out there for training. There's Dementia Friends that, for example, the Alzheimer's Society run, which is a course that I've attended and which I would commend people to look at. So that's as much time as we have for the discussion. Thank you so much for joining and sharing your experience and insight, Alastair.
Thank you, David, very much indeed for giving me the chance to reflect on it, but also through you to talk to your friends and colleagues. And I'm delighted to conclude just by saying the member of your profession with whom we've had the closest contact has played a blinder and been a star. And whether he had prepared for that or not, I've no idea. But he demonstrated how easy it is. He respected us and he was helpful. And we feel much safer as a result of those conversations.
The Today's Wills and Probate podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todayswillsandprobate.co.uk. My thanks to Alastair. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
One of the leading sources of information for the wills and probate sector. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todayswillsandprobate.co.uk and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.